Good morning. Good morning, dear friends. Before we start this session, or in order to start this session, I have invited Christiana to make some impromptu remarks or reflections on how this practice of deep listening and beginning anew or restoring communication has been impactful in her work. And I sent her a message earlier this morning to ask if she would be willing to do this, but she's a very good practitioner, so she hasn't looked at her phone. So this will be even more present moment based. So Christiana, thank you for your willingness to flow.
Good morning, everyone. Yes, I was just informed of this 2 seconds ago, so I'm quickly gathering my thoughts. Perhaps I will share this. In the context of a negotiation, which is not what we're doing here, but is very often what we continue to do outside, whether we're negotiating a legal text or whether we're negotiating the next step of our campaign, our efforts, we're very often in a situation in which we are working with people who, lo and behold, have their own opinions. What a discovery. And their own positions and their own way of doing things. Even if they're in our team, let alone if they're not in our team. And so in that very frequent situation that we all find ourselves in, I have found that this practice that we're now going to explain and begin to practice has been incredibly helpful to me, I would say, on 3 accounts. First, because it really, if you do it truly from very deep sense in you, not just pretending that you're listening, but truly deeply listening, it gives the other person a very important sense of being heard. Not being heard, speaking or having an opinion or doing something, and not being heard or not being seen by other people is very painful and can lead to many words and actions that perhaps are unnecessary. So first, it really opens the space for the other person to feel truly and deeply listened to, heard, understood. Secondly, what I have found is that it is a very good invitation for me to soften my boundaries. When I stand in front of someone or I sit in front of someone, I always come with my own opinion. None of you ever do, but if we come with our own opinion about A, B, C, D, and we inadvertently, unconsciously, there are boundaries around that opinion about what we want to do, how we think, how we should act. There are boundaries, and the more we stay within our own opinion, the harder those boundaries become, and the more difficult to work collaboratively. So truly listening to someone else who has a different opinion, a different way of looking at things, a different way of looking at life, helps me to soften my boundaries. And thirdly, because that person feels listened to, and because I have softened my boundaries, the miracle occurs, which is the common ground begins to emerge. Almost on its own. It really is magic. You don't even have to premeditatively go into that conversation. It comes much more out of a very authentic listening, authentic softening of my own boundaries, and then just standing back and watching what emerges, and then harvesting what emerges, which is more often than not much wiser than whatever opinion you went in with.
Thank you, Christiana. This gives me the feeling that we should have more unpremeditated Christiana. It's pretty good stuff. So, this is going to be a workshop-style session. But for the first 10 or 15 minutes, I want to share a little bit about the practice that we're going to do. And then we're going to do it. So we call this the art of communicating. It's also the art of restoring communication. Because I think, well, I don't want to speak for all of you, but let's put it as a question instead. Have any of you in your lives up until now never been in the situation where communication has been broken? You can raise your hand if you've never experienced a breakdown in communication. Okay, all right. So I didn't see any hands raised. And so, yeah, we know that sometimes there's a need to restore communication. And the way that we want to offer you as a possibility to do that is based on understanding suffering, primarily. So it's not based on the idea of proving how right we were and getting our way, but it's based on seeing the suffering in the other person and giving rise to compassion. But before we do that, we actually have to see and recognize and have the space for our own suffering. And that's not our own righteousness, right? That's not quite the same thing. It's a much more vulnerable, much more tender place that we have to go to. That's sort of a little bit prior to our stories about what happened, about how right we were and how wrong the other person was. And it's sort of a little bit separate from all of that. It's just actually, like, for example, right now, how we feel in our body. And that may not be completely comfortable, especially if you are, as I would like you to do, if you're bringing to mind a conflictual situation. So I want you to sort of bear in mind throughout this session, maybe you can sort of pick one relationship that is really important to you, a relationship that matters with somebody that you really care about, whether professionally or personally or both. But with whom that communication may be a little bit tense right now. There's something's happened where feelings have been hurt, and or there's been a kind of, we feel misunderstood. Maybe the other person feels misunderstood. Maybe there's a feeling of an irreconcilable difference of opinion. Maybe even to the point where we are no longer speaking to each other. So at whatever stage that relationship is at, I kind of want you to hold it in your heart and to notice that somewhat independent of the content of that communication, in relation to that situation or that relationship, there may be there's just a feeling of being of hurt, and we need to acknowledge that and tend to that first before we try to dive into the solving, fixing. And just to have patience and time for that, and to listen to ourselves, to listen to our own bodies. So that's the ground. The ground is suffering and the understanding of suffering, our own suffering and the suffering of the other person. And we won't really have the space to even dare to remember that the other person is a human being who is also suffering until we've started to take care of our own suffering in that situation. But we can already connect deeply with our own wish to understand. We know that we want to understand, ultimately. It can be worth contemplating the relationship in the light of impermanence as well. This is something that our teacher would invite us to do. He would say, you think about you and the person that you are in a disagreement with, and you ask yourself, where will we be in 300 years? You visualize it. What will have become of this disagreement? What will be our legacy? And what do we want our legacy to be? Do I want my legacy to be that I was right? And that I didn't bend? Or do I want something else? And can we let go of being right even if the other person doesn't? It's really hard. There's something in us that says that we shouldn't. Or that we shouldn't let go of being right until the other person has acknowledged that something. Right? That we shouldn't show any sign of weakness, or that it would be a sign of weakness to be the first to acknowledge that we may have been unskillful. There's something in us that tells us not to do that. So then we have a choice. Do I want to be guided by my pride or by love? And that's a choice that we can make. But I find it interesting for myself to put it in those terms. And then I'm kind of proud about not being proud. I'm like, no. I'm not going to be guided by pride. I'm going to, give ground. So we can kind of play some tricks on ourselves. And our anger and our pride will for sure tell us that it's wrong to let go first, to give ground first. But until we do, there's no way to even hear what the other person is saying. Right? If we're so sure that we are the injured party, we won't be able to hear what the other person is saying. And that doesn't mean that we put ourselves in a situation where we don't get to express the ways in which we may have been hurt as well, because we also create an opportunity to do that. But we have to create a space where it's possible that we maybe it's unlikely, but it's just possible that we were a little bit unskillful, and we might possibly have done something not optimal. And that maybe there's then a little space, a little bit of curiosity to find out, and how was that for you? And maybe to realize, my ultimate wish is not to make this person whom I care about suffer. My ultimate wish is not this situation of tension and conflict. So we have to listen to ourselves, first of all, listen to our pain. But we have to be very careful of the narrative of being the victim in this situation of conflict, and the corresponding blaming that goes with that narrative. So the question is how to listen to ourselves and to our pain without so much listening to our story about what happened. Because for sure we have a story about what happened. They said this, and then they did that, and they should have done that, and why did they? And can't believe that they did, and how could they? You know, we have a great story. It's a really good story. You know, but is it possible to recognize that story, to know that it's there, and to say, you know, I know that you're there, I hear you, but for now, I'm going to pay attention not to the words, not to the narrative, but to the felt sense of my body, like this feeling of nausea, this feeling of tension in my chest or in my throat, this tightness in my abdomen. I'm going to listen to that. I'm going to take care of that. I'm a mammal, you know, self-soothing, listening to my nervous system, recognizing that my nervous system is in distress. It maybe needs some long, slow breaths. Maybe it needs me to remember my connection with the ground. So that's a kind of listening, which is really, really important. And we can know that the story is there, but we have to be very careful not to believe it too much. And we have to allow our loved ones or the people we're in a relationship with not to be perfect. It's hard because we would like them so much to be perfect. It would be so great. But maybe we can, you know, just give them permission to be a little bit human. And we don't give up on them. In many situations, it seems easier to say, that's it, enough. I won't take this anymore. I've had it with you. And to cut the other person off. I won't talk to you. You know, until X, Y, Z, until you acknowledge that when no, you should have, no. We put all kinds of conditions. But when we ask ourselves again this question in the light of what is our legacy in 300 years? Will our legacy be that, you know, we that we held our ground, that we waited for them to be the first to, you know, to apologize, to back down? Will that, because that legacy continues, that tension in the relationship, that frayedness, that brokenness, it reverberates into all our other relationships, into the other person's life, into our own life. Is that what we want our continuation to be? Or is it something else? I think in principle, we all want to be able to say that we are people who are open, right? We're open to change. We value openness. But I think with a little honest self-examination, we can find examples of times when maybe we could have been a little bit more open-minded. So openness is a kind of art. And I think discomfort is actually a good sign. Because if we're really going to be open, I think it's going to involve some discomfort. It's going to involve some real willingness to soften our boundaries, to change our view of the situation. And that's not, fundamentally, it's not super comfortable to do that. So if we're going a little bit into that discomfort, it's probably a good sign. So we shouldn't expect it to be easy. And there should be a kind of willingness on our part to go, oh, okay, all right, fine, okay, I'll let go of my view, fine, just this once. That's probably, okay, there's a little stretching going on. It's like yoga, you go into a deep stretch. It's not exactly super comfortable, right? But there's something good about it. There is. So this is a kind of emotional, cognitive stretch that we're willing to make. It's good for us. And I think the last thing I want to say in this sort of preamble is that, again, in the light of impermanence, it's really, really important to allow the other person to be new. And to allow ourselves to be new. Because for sure we have our story about what we are, what is right for us, what is appropriate and inappropriate, and who the other person is and what they did and what was right and what was wrong. But we might be wrong. Again, it only takes a little bit of self-reflection. We can look back over a few examples in our life, and I'm sure you can find cases where you can say, oh yeah, well, no, not every time, but every so often, once in a while, maybe I didn't completely grasp every aspect of the situation. I'm sure mostly you're completely right about everything, but maybe you can find one example where you didn't see every angle. Maybe not. Maybe that's just me. But I think it's also a kind of generosity of spirit to say, I'm not going to hold you in my story version of you. I'm not going to force you to be exactly the person I think you are. I'm not even going to hold you to the notion of what it is I think you did or said, because I might be wrong, even if I'm really sure that I'm right. We have to introduce that question mark. Say, well, maybe my perception was a little off. Maybe my perception was a little distorted by my own emotions, by how important this issue is to me. Right? When we're very passionate about something, it can affect how we see it, how we understand it. So we know these things about ourselves. And we know that ultimately we are an ever-changing reality. Right? That you can't step into the same river twice. Not only because the river is changing, but because you are changing. You go back to the river, you're not the same person. So we allow each other to be constantly flowing realities. Okay. So, with all of that, we're going to do this practice, and we're going to go through 4 steps. And I just invite you to sort of flow with it, and then I will write on the board what the steps were afterwards, so that you can remember what they are and sort of have a map of the practice. But I'm not going to tell you in advance. Okay, we're just going to do it, and then we'll sort of systematize it afterwards. And we want to listen to and understand our own pain. Remember, not the story. We sort of put the story to one side. We'll take care of that later. And we have to beware of the victim narrative, beware of our own victim narrative. And we have to know how to recognize it. And we want to understand the suffering of the other person. We want to be able to put ourselves in their skin. What is it like to be them in this situation? We should, in principle, be willing to let go of being right, or to let go of being completely right. Okay, we can say, I'm partly right, which means I'm partly wrong. And maybe they are partly right, and there's room for them to be partly wrong as well. And this is really in the light of what do we want our legacy to be? Do we want our legacy to be that we were right and that we never gave in, Or do we want our legacy to be love and reconciliation, healing? As a general rule, it's very helpful to acknowledge that we sometimes, although very rarely, have been wrong in the past, that we haven't had the complete picture of the situation. And maybe in this situation, we also don't have the whole picture. Openness, although we are committed to it in principle, we recognize that we're not always all that open to change, and that a little bit of discomfort is a good sign. Right? Because openness is a stretch, and if there isn't any discomfort, it probably means we're not doing it yet. We want to give ourselves and the other person a chance to be new, to not conform to our expectations of them or to our narrative of them. We don't want to confine the other person to our story about them. That means we have to not be too sure about what happened or about who they are, and especially about what they meant, their intention. Right? We may be very sure about what happened, what they said, and what they said and did, but how can we really be sure what they intended? That at least we can have a little bit of humility about. Okay, and then so we did this in a kind of safe context where you are with somebody who is not that person you are in a conflict with. The next challenge is to do the same thing, if you possibly can, with that person. Now, you might not be able to do all 4 of the steps in that order unless there's somebody who shares this practice and an understanding of this framework. It might not be the most skillful thing to say, right, we're going to sit down and we're going to do this thing that I learned about on this retreat. And, and you have to sit there and listen. Yeah, maybe not the most skillful thing. So we can find kind of stealth ways to do it, okay? Underground. It doesn't have to be overt. It doesn't have to be obvious. You can always appreciate somebody's qualities. Right? And it's probably the thing we least want to do when we're in a conflict with somebody, but it is the most important thing to do, especially when we are in a conflict with somebody. But you don't need to wait until you're in a conflict with them. Right? If you have somebody that you love in your life, you can appreciate their qualities now, right? Before you get into a disagreement with them. This is, in our practice, what we call watering the flowers. Sometimes our loved one, although we know that they are like a flower in the garden of humanity, that they have beautiful qualities, sometimes the flower is a little bit wilted. It hasn't had much water recently. And maybe it's because we didn't take the time to water the flower. So it could be your child, it could be your parent, it could be your partner. Just recognizing, oh, the other day when you said that, that meant a lot to me. That was really touching. Thank you. Thank you for your kindness and generosity. Thank you for your spirit of openness, or whatever it is that you see in them. And maybe it's something that they haven't acknowledged in themselves. It can be very, very moving, very transformative in a relationship. Just that. So sometimes you only need this, just the first step. It can already change the whole situation. Try it with a sibling. Interesting. Okay, and the next step, this is just good psychology, okay? We don't dive straight into the conflict, and that's always what we want to do. It's like, why did you say that? Why did you do that? This is good psychology. You start by watering their flowers, you start by acknowledging their beauty, and maybe as a result, they become a little bit more beautiful in that moment, a little bit more open, a little bit more able to receive what you have to say. Okay, but it's not instrumental, right? It's not in order to. It's not, okay, I'm gonna prepare the ground and then I'm gonna deliver the punch, you know? So we have to be careful not to misuse the practice. So next, instead of diving into the conflict, we still wait, we express our regret. And we acknowledge that we're not always 100% skillful, and sometimes we do or say things that unintentionally have caused harm. And it's just really healthy to acknowledge that. We let our guard down a little bit. We don't maintain our pride too much. And then if those two things go well, we may feel that the ground is ready, you know, the situation is appropriate to express our hurt. Without blaming. So we try to be factual. For example, it could be like, I need you to know that when you said that, when you did that, it was really hard for me because X. Or that for me was like this. I felt like this when you said that. So there's no assumption that the other person meant to hurt you. It's not, you don't launch in with, I can't believe you, how could you say that to me? And but just saying, when you said that, it was hard. It's just information that the other person may not have. They may not realize how it was hard for you or why it was hard for you. And then, if all of that goes well, you can express an aspiration for the relationship. And this can be sometimes, this can take different forms. It can be for the relationship, it can be for yourself, it can be asking for support. It could be asking for the other person's support not to water the seed of anger in you, right? Or not to water the seed of jealousy. So when you do that, that's really hard for me. Please, I need your support. Could you help me by not doing that when we go to a dinner party or whatever, right? By not flirting with other people, that would really help me. For example, and it might be something else, but just sort of asking for the other person's sincere support to transform the relationship.